19 gospel legends you didn't know passed away. They were the voices carried broken hearts and turned pain into praise. For years they sounded larger than life, untouchable, eternal, impossible to forget. But when they died, many of them slipped away with barely a whisper beyond the pews that loved them most. How does a voice that powerful leave this world so quietly? Subscribe to Black Legends Revealed and step into the stories the world never honored loudly enough. Duranice Pace. Before her name ever trended online, Duranice Pace was already carrying a voice shaped by survival. Born in Atlanta in 1958, she grew up as the eldest of the famed The Anointed Pace sisters, but her path never followed the polished arc people expect from gospel royalty. Her voice didn't aim for perfection. It trembled, cracked, and surged with something deeper, as if every note had to fight its way out. That rawness came from a life marked by hardship. She spoke openly about enduring abuse and later surviving a poisoning incident so severe that doctors reportedly gave her little time to live. Yet she remained frail at times but unshaken in spirit. Her recordings were rarely studio polished. Many of the performances that reached millions were captured in living rooms, small churches, or simple gatherings. Still clips of her singing "I'm Still Here" spread widely across social media, not because of production quality, but because of what people felt in her voice. It wasn't entertainment. It was testimony. While others chased mainstream visibility, Duranice's influence grew in a different direction, quietly, deeply, through people who saw their own pain reflected in her delivery. What does it mean when a voice doesn't sound perfect but feels undeniable? That question sits at the center of her story. She never became a dominant commercial figure, yet her impact cut across generations of listeners who didn't need charts to recognize truth. When she passed away in January 2021 at age 62, her death didn't dominate headlines. But within gospel communities, the loss was immediate and profound. Tributes poured in not from spectacle, but from memory, moments where her songs had carried someone through something they couldn't explain. Duranice Pace didn't disappear because she was forgotten. She lived and sang in spaces the spotlight rarely reaches. And in doing so, she left behind something more lasting than fame, a voice that proved survival itself can sound like worship. Dottie Rambo. Before the road went quiet, it was always moving. Night after night, mile after mile, Dottie Rambo carried her songs across small churches, revival tents, and concert halls, never chasing spotlight, only purpose. She wasn't just a singer. She was a writer of over 2,500 gospel songs, including classics like "I Go to the Rock and He Looked Beyond My Fault and Saw My Need." Her words didn't aim for applause. They reached into places where people held their deepest grief and faith at the same time. That's what made her different. You didn't just listen to Dottie Rambo, you leaned on her. Her life was not polished. She endured hardship, personal loss, and years of struggle that could have silenced a lesser voice. But instead of stepping away, she kept moving, literally. Touring constantly, often in modest conditions, she brought her music directly to the people who needed it most. Her voice wasn't built on vocal acrobatics. It carried something steadier, something lived in. Every lyric felt handwritten in pain and belief. And isn't that what makes a voice unforgettable? Not how perfect it sounds, but how true it feels. In May 2008, that long journey ended suddenly. While traveling to a ministry event, the bus she was riding in crashed in Missouri, taking her life instantly. She died the same way she lived on the road, still in motion, still giving. The news didn't explode across mainstream media, but within gospel circles it landed like a shockwave, because people understood what had been lost. Dottie Rambo didn't fade from Hollywood or walk away from fame, she simply lived outside of it. Her disappearance wasn't a slow decline. It was a sudden silence after decades of unwavering presence. Today, her songs still echo in churches, funerals, and quiet moments of prayer, not as relics, but as lifelines. Because what she left behind wasn't just music, it was a language for faith when words are hardest to find. Timothy Wright. Reverend Timothy Wright fits this title far better when the focus shifts from church controversy to a different kind of shock, the quiet way a giant of gospel slipped from public conversation after his death. Known to many as the godfather of gospel, Wright was not a minor church singer. He was a towering voice in modern gospel, a Brooklyn pastor whose music traveled through sanctuaries, choirs, and radio for decades. He began in church music as a teenager, later formed the Timothy Wright Concert Choir, and built a recording career that produced respected albums such as Come Thou Almighty King and Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. His 1994 album, Come Thou Almighty King, reached Billboard's top 20 gospel albums and earned a Grammy nomination, confirming that his influence extended well beyond one congregation. What makes his story fit a title like legendary musicians who died and many people didn't know is not that he lacked stature. It is the opposite. Inside gospel music, Timothy Wright was deeply revered, but outside that world, many mainstream listeners never realized that he died in 2009 after one of the most heartbreaking final chapters imaginable. On July 4, 2008, Wright was critically injured in a car crash on Interstate 80 in Pennsylvania. The crash also killed his wife and grandson, along with the driver of the other vehicle. He died on April 24, 2009, from injuries connected to that accident at age 61. How many true music legends have already left this world while the wider public barely noticed? That question gives Timothy Wright's story its ache. His death was not the fading end of a forgotten figure. It was the loss of a major gospel architect whose songs had carried grief, endurance, and hope for years before his own life ended in tragedy. That is why he belongs in this title, not because he was obscure, but because his greatness was so rooted in gospel that many outside that tradition never understood how much music history was lost when he died. James Moore. Some voices do more than sing. They enter a room like weather. Reverend James Moore had that kind of voice, deep, commanding, wounded, and full of conviction. When he opened his mouth on songs like He Was There All the Time or It's Good to Know Jesus, it did not feel like performance. It felt like someone pulling testimony straight out of pain and laying it before the church. That is why his story fits this title so strongly. He was one of gospel's most powerful voices, yet his passing in 2000 did not receive the kind of broad public attention that should have matched his spiritual and musical weight. Born in Detroit in 1956, Moore rose through gospel with a voice that carried both thunder and tenderness. He was not polished in a fragile way. He sounded lived in. His delivery had the kind of gravity that could stop a congregation mid-breath. His albums through the late 1980s and 1990s helped establish him as one of the most affecting male voices in contemporary gospel, and listeners returned to him not because he chased trends, but because he sang as though eternity were close enough to touch. Behind that power, though, was a body under siege. Moore battled diabetes for years, and the disease slowly took a brutal toll on his health. Even as complications worsened and his mobility declined, he kept ministering. In some later appearances, he sang from a wheelchair, his body visibly weakened, yet the voice still carried force. That contrast made his presence even more unforgettable. What hits harder than watching a man weaken physically while the fire in his voice refuses to die? When Reverend James Moore passed away on June 7, 2000, at only 43 years old, gospel music lost more than a singer. It lost a vessel people trusted in their darkest hours. His death may have moved quietly beyond church circles, but inside the gospel world, the loss was immense. His songs still endure because they do what great gospel music must do. They meet suffering without flinching and turn it into faith. James Moore did not merely sing hope. He sounded like a man who had fought to keep it. Orlando Draper. Orlando Draper built his legacy in a way that rarely depended on mainstream spotlight, yet his influence ran deep through gospel music circles. As the founder of the Associates Choir of Chicago, Draper didn't just direct voices, he shaped a sound that carried weight, discipline, and spiritual urgency. Albums like More Than a Melody and I'm Still Standing weren't designed for pop charts. They were crafted for churches, for choirs, for people who understood what it meant to feel music as testimony rather than entertainment. That's what makes his story quietly powerful and quietly overlooked. Draper passed away in 2013 at the age of 52 after suffering a heart attack. Within gospel communities, his death was felt immediately. Tributes came from choirs, musicians, and church leaders who had either worked with him or been shaped by his arrangements. But outside that space, the moment moved with far less noise. There were no breaking headlines on major networks, no widespread cultural pause. A man who had helped define a generation of choir sound left the world, and much of the broader audience never realized it had happened. How many artists have shaped the sound of a generation without ever being fully seen by the world outside their circle? That question sits at the center of Orlando Draper's story. His absence is not marked by disappearance, but by contrast between how deeply he mattered within gospel and how quietly his passing registered beyond it. He continued working, mentoring, and building music until the very end, never chasing the kind of visibility that defines mainstream fame. He belongs in this title because his death reveals a different kind of loss. Not the fall of a widely known celebrity, but the quiet departure of a musical architect whose work lives on in voices that still echo his arrangements. Orlando Draper was never small. The world simply wasn't always looking in the direction where his impact was strongest. Lashun Pace. Some voices don't just rise, they carry weight. Lashun Pace had that kind of presence, the kind that could move from a whisper to a cry without losing truth in either. Born in Atlanta in 1961, she emerged from the powerful legacy of the anointed Pace sisters, but her solo path revealed something even more personal. When she sang, "I Know I've Been Changed," it didn't feel rehearsed. It felt remembered, like a testimony unfolding in real time. Her career was never built on spectacle. It was built on endurance. Behind the strength in her voice was a life marked by loss and physical struggle. She battled kidney disease for years, enduring dialysis while continuing to travel and minister. At the same time, she carried the grief of losing her daughter, an absence that never truly leaves, only changes shape. Yet she kept showing up. Concerts, church services, recordings, she did not step back when life tightened around her. What kind of strength does it take to stand in front of people and sing about hope when your own life is breaking in pieces? That question follows every performance she gave. Her delivery often shifted mid-song, soft, almost fragile one moment, then rising into something fierce as if she were refusing to let pain have the final word. Albums like Shekinah Glory and Act Like You Know captured that duality, a voice grounded in gospel tradition but sharpened by lived experience. When Lashun Pace passed away in March 2022 at around 60 years old, the wider world barely paused. But within gospel circles, the loss was deeply felt. Choirs sang her songs with heavier meaning. Listeners returned to her recordings not for nostalgia, but for strength. She didn't chase visibility, and she didn't need it. What she left behind was something harder to measure, a voice that proved faith is not the absence of pain, but the decision to keep singing through it. Rance Allen. Rance Allen didn't just sing, he broke open a room. From the late 1960s, fronting the Rance Allen Group with his brothers. His voice cut across gospel with a raw, electrified edge that felt closer to soul and funk than traditional church restraint. Songs like Something About the Name Jesus and Miracle Worker didn't sit politely in pews. They moved, stretched, testified. By the time gospel began crossing into mainstream ears, Allen was already there, blending sacred message with a sound that felt alive, urgent, and unmistakably his. That kind of impact should have guaranteed universal recognition. It didn't. Within gospel, Rance Allen was revered, a pioneer, a bridge between generations, a performer who helped reshape how church music could sound and feel. But outside that world, many listeners knew the influence without always knowing the name. His work reached radio-influenced artists across genres and earned him multiple Grammy nominations. Yet his visibility remained rooted mostly within gospel audiences. When he passed away in November 2020 at the age of 71, following complications from surgery, The loss was deeply felt where his music had always lived, but far quieter in the broader cultural conversation. How does a voice that helped redefine a genre leave this world without the entire industry stopping to notice? That question gives his story its weight. Because Rance Allen's legacy isn't hidden, it's embedded. You hear it in the way gospel evolved, in the freedom singers took after him, in the emotional range he made possible. His death fits this title not because he lacked greatness, but because that greatness was never fully translated to mainstream awareness. Rance Allen didn't fade. He remained active, preaching, performing, and leading as a bishop until the final chapter. And when that chapter closed, what disappeared wasn't just a man. It was a sound, a presence, a kind of spiritual electricity that had been shaping music for decades, often without the wider world realizing just how much it was listening. Jesse Dixon. Some artists carry gospel into the world. Jesse Dixon carried the world into gospel, rising from Chicago's rich church tradition. His voice didn't stay confined to sanctuary walls. It traveled, crossing genres, stages, and continents. When he sang, there was a smoothness that invited listeners in, but beneath it was conviction that refused to soften. That balance made him different. He wasn't trying to make gospel popular. He made it unavoidable. His career took a remarkable turn when he began collaborating with Paul Simon, touring internationally and bringing gospel sound to audiences who had never experienced it in that form. It was a rare moment, sacred music stepping into global arenas without losing its core. Dixon stood on those stages not as a crossover act, but as a messenger who refused to dilute what he believed. Whether in a grand concert hall or a small church, his delivery remained the same, steady, sincere, and grounded. What happens when a voice reaches the world, but the world never fully recognizes the weight behind it? That question lingers in his story. Despite his reach, he never became a household name in the mainstream sense. Instead, he became something quieter, and in many ways more enduring, a bridge between spaces that rarely meet. He blended gospel with jazz, soul, and contemporary sounds, shaping a style that later artists would build upon without always tracing it back to him. Behind the music was a man known for humility. He mentored younger performers, encouraged originality, and focused more on message than recognition. His strength was not in spectacle, but in consistency, showing up with the same purpose whether the audience was thousands or a handful. When Jesse Dixon passed away in September 2011, after a private battle with cancer, the loss did not dominate headlines. But within the communities he touched, it was deeply felt. His voice did not fade, it spread. It lives on in artists who dare to stretch gospel beyond expectation while keeping its truth intact. Walter Hawkins. Walter Hawkins didn't chase the spotlight. He built something that outlived it. In the late 1960s, when gospel still moved largely within church walls, Hawkins helped create a sound that felt expansive, almost cinematic in its reach. With the Love Center Choir in Oakland, he recorded "Oh Happy Day," a song that didn't just succeed, it crossed over, climbed charts, and carried gospel into spaces that had rarely opened their doors to it. The record went gold, earned a Grammy, and quietly changed what gospel music could be in the public imagination. But success like that can be deceptive. While "Oh Happy Day" became a global anthem, Hawkins himself never fully occupied the mainstream spotlight the way the song did. He continued shaping gospel through albums, choirs, and ministry, influencing generations of singers and musicians who carried his style forward. Inside gospel, his name held weight, respect, authority, history. Outside of it, many people knew the music, but not the man behind it. How does someone create one of the most recognizable gospel songs in history and still remain invisible to so much of the world? That question lingers even more when you look at how his story ended. Walter Hawkins passed away in July 2010 at the age of 61 after a battle with pancreatic cancer. Within gospel circles, the loss was immediate and deeply felt. Tributes poured in from artists, choirs, and churches that had been shaped by his work. But beyond that world, the moment moved with far less attention than his influence might suggest. His place in this title comes from that contrast. Not a forgotten figure, but a partially unseen one. Walter Hawkins helped open the door for gospel to reach beyond the church, yet when he left, much of the wider audience never fully realized who had been standing behind that sound all along. Andraé Crouch. Before gospel crossed into the mainstream with confidence, Andraé Crouch was already building the bridge. Born in 1942 and raised in a pastor's home, he didn't just learn music, he absorbed ministry. When he sat at the piano, something shifted. His songs didn't feel confined to church walls. They moved outward, carrying faith into spaces that had rarely welcomed it. With anthems like "The Blood Will Never Lose Its Power" and "Soon and Very Soon," he didn't simply write music, he created language for people navigating grief, hope, and redemption at the same time. What made Crouch different was his refusal to choose between tradition and innovation. He fused gospel with soul pop and even elements of funk long before it became acceptable. That boldness opened doors. He worked with global artists, contributed to major projects including involvement with Bad, and helped bring gospel influence into mainstream sound without diluting its message. Still, his focus never drifted. Whether performing in a packed arena or a small church, the intent remained the same: connection over spectacle. But success did not shield him from struggle. Behind the music were personal losses, health challenges, and the quiet weight of carrying a movement that was larger than himself. As years passed, his body began to slow, but his creativity didn't. He kept writing, producing, guiding, shaping not just songs, but the future direction of gospel music itself. What does it mean to change an entire genre and still remain rooted in something deeper than recognition? That question defines his legacy. When Andraé Crouch passed away in January 2015, the reaction extended far beyond gospel circles. Artists across genres acknowledged the loss of someone who had reshaped how sacred music could sound and where it could go. Yet his absence wasn't marked by silence. His influence echoes every time gospel blends with contemporary sound, every time a choir dares to step outside tradition without losing its core. He didn't just follow the path, he redrew it, then stepped aside and let others walk it forward. Thomas Whitfield. Thomas Whitfield didn't just direct choirs, he sculpted sound like a filmmaker shapes light. In Detroit, long before his name traveled widely, Whitfield was already bending gospel into something larger, layering harmonies with a precision that felt almost orchestral. When the Thomas Whitfield Company stepped forward in the early 1980s, albums like Hallelujah Anyhow and Alive and Satisfied didn't just fill churches, they expanded them, turning every note into a landscape of emotion. His arrangements moved with intention, voices rising and folding into each other like scenes unfolding on a screen. Never rushed, never careless. There was discipline behind that beauty. Whitfield was known for pushing choirs beyond comfort, demanding exactness, timing, and emotional truth all at once. Those who sang under his direction often spoke of rehearsals that felt relentless, where every detail mattered. But when the music finally came together, it carried a kind of depth that couldn't be faked. Songs like "I Shall Wear a Crown" didn't simply resonate, they lingered, echoing in sanctuaries long after the final note faded, becoming part of the emotional memory of a generation. What does it take for a composer to create music that feels less like performance and more like something eternal? That question followed Whitfield even as his life moved toward its final chapter. In 1992, he passed away at just 38 years old after battling colon cancer, a loss that felt sudden, almost unfinished. There was no long farewell, no gradual retreat from the stage. One moment, the architect of a new gospel sound was still building. The next, the music had to carry his voice without him. Thomas Whitfield's legacy lives in that contrast, the precision of his craft against the brevity of his life. He didn't just leave behind songs, he left behind a way of hearing gospel itself, where every chord feels intentional, every silence meaningful, and every performance just one step away from something larger than the room it begins in. Inez Andrews. Before the first note even landed, the room already knew something was about to happen. Inez Andrews didn't sing to impress, she released something deeper, something that felt older than the moment itself. As a defining voice within the caravans, she stood tall, literally and spiritually, bringing a sound that was raw, piercing, and unmistakably her own. Songs like "Lord, Don't Move the Mountain" weren't delivered softly. They were cried out, stretched, and carried until they filled every corner of the room. Her voice didn't glide, it surged. What made Andrews unforgettable wasn't polish, it was force. She could hold a note until it felt like time itself had paused, then break it open with a cry that sounded like prayer turned inside out. In an industry that often favored smoother tones, her intensity stood apart. She didn't adjust to fit expectation. She brought her full weight into every performance, as if each song had to mean something before it could be sung. What kind of voice doesn't just perform but confronts you? That question sits at the center of her legacy. Off stage, she lived a life grounded in faith, raising a family, while continuing to travel, minister, and serve. She didn't rely on headlines or commercial success to validate her work. Her impact moved through churches, recordings, and the countless singers who absorbed her style without always naming the source. When Inez Andrews passed away in December 2012 at the age of 83, the news didn't dominate mainstream attention. But within gospel circles, it felt like a foundational sound had gone quiet. Not erased, just no longer standing in front of the microphone. Her voice still lingers in old recordings in choir lofts in the way a singer stretches a note just a little longer, letting emotion carry it past technique. She didn't simply contribute to gospel music, she imprinted it with a sound that refuses to disappear. Mattie Moss Clark. Before the choir rises in perfect unison, before the swell of voices hits with precision and power, there was a woman who insisted it could be done differently. Mattie Moss Clark didn't just lead singers, she reshaped how gospel choirs sounded, moved, and thought. In an era when passion often outweighed structure, she introduced discipline without stripping away spirit. Rehearsals under her direction weren't casual gatherings. They were exacting, demanding, almost surgical. Every note mattered. Every entrance had purpose. And slowly the sound of gospel began to change. She brought three-part harmonies, dynamic modulation, and layered arrangements into church spaces that had rarely experienced that level of musical architecture. Choirs trained by her didn't just sing, they executed. They breathed together, moved together, and built songs like something living. Through her work with the Clark sisters, she didn't just raise daughters, she raised innovators who would carry her vision into a new era of gospel music. That legacy alone would have been enough. But she didn't stop there. What does it take to transform an entire sound and still remain behind it? That question defines her presence. She wasn't chasing the spotlight. She was building the system that others would later stand on. Her influence spread through conventions, workshops, and countless choirs that adopted her methods without always tracing them back to her name. Even as her health declined in the late 1980s and early 1990s, she continued to teach, correct, and shape voices with the same intensity. When Mattie Moss Clark passed away in 1994, it didn't register as a mainstream loss. But within gospel, it marked a turning point. The architect was gone, but the structure remained. You can still hear her in the way choirs build tension before release, in the precision of harmonies, in the confidence of singers who know exactly where they belong in a sound. She didn't just direct music. She designed a legacy that still sings every Sunday. Albertina Walker. Before gospel crowns were spoken aloud, Albertina Walker was already wearing one. She came out of Chicago with a voice that did not ask for attention, it seized it. In the early 1950s, when she founded the Caravans, she was not merely assembling singers. She was building a sanctuary of sound, a place where raw devotion, discipline, and power could live in the same breath. From that group would emerge towering names like Shirley Caesar and Inez Andrews, but Walker remained the gravitational force at the center, the woman whose conviction could turn a song into something that felt almost physical in the room. Her singing never sounded delicate. It sounded weathered, commanding, alive. When Albertina Walker opened her mouth on songs like "Please Be Patient With Me" or "The Best Is Yet to Come," The effect was larger than melody. You could hear struggle in it. You could hear survival. You could hear a faith that had been tested hard enough to earn its authority. She did not perform gospel as decoration. She delivered it like witness testimony, each line landing with the weight of a life already lived. How many singers can move a room so deeply that their voice feels less like music and more like memory? That is what made her different. She was not simply a star within gospel. She was one of its master builders. Her influence stretched across decades through choirs, solo recordings, protégés, and churches that carried her phrasing long after the service ended. The title Queen of Gospel was not a gesture of affection. It was recognition of what she had done to the genre itself. When Albertina Walker died in October 2010 at the age of 81, gospel did not just lose a singer. It lost one of its great architects. Yet outside that world, many people never fully understood the scale of the woman who had left. That is what gives her story its cinematic force. She did not burn brightly for a moment. She stood like a cathedral, strong, towering, and impossible to replace once the voice was gone. James Cleveland. Before gospel choirs sounded organized, before arrangements carried structure and emotional build, there was a man who understood that music in the church could be both spirit and system. James Cleveland didn't arrive with a polished, radio-perfect voice. His tone was rough, textured, sometimes almost strained, but that was exactly why people believed him. When he sang, it felt like truth moving through a human voice, not a performance trying to impress. He helped shape songs like Peace Be Still and Lord Help Me to Hold Out, but his real impact went far beyond individual recordings. Cleveland organized sound. He taught choirs how to blend, how to rise and fall with intention, how to turn a simple hymn into something that felt like a full spiritual experience. In 1967, he founded the Gospel Music Workshop of America, creating a national platform where singers, musicians, and directors could train, connect, and refine their craft. That decision alone changed the trajectory of gospel music for generations. What does it mean to build a system so strong that people follow it without even knowing your name? That question sits at the core of his legacy. Cleveland wasn't just a singer standing in front of a choir, he was the force shaping what that choir would become. His presence moved between pulpit and piano, between teaching and performing, never separating message from music. He could speak softly, guiding a congregation through meaning, then erupt into song with a weight that felt undeniable. When Reverend James Cleveland passed away in 1991 at the age of 59, the loss did not dominate mainstream headlines. But within gospel, it marked the end of a foundational era. The man who helped construct the modern sound of church music was gone, yet his influence remained embedded in every rehearsal, every modulation, every choir that sings with both precision and purpose. He didn't just sing the gospel, he taught the world how to sing it. G.E. Patterson. G.E. Patterson did not step into the pulpit. He entered it like a current. In Memphis, inside the vast sanctuary of Temple of Deliverance, his voice carried a rhythm that felt closer to music than speech. Every pause held tension. Every rise pulled the room forward. Broadcasts of his sermons reached far beyond the walls of the church, turning him into one of the most recognized voices in the Church of God in Christ. For many, he represented authority that felt undeniable, rooted in tradition, yet alive with urgency. But even a voice like that moves through storms. His leadership did not exist in a vacuum. Patterson's rise to the presiding bishop position came after deep internal conflict within the denomination, years of division that tested loyalty, structure, and power at the highest level of the church. The tension wasn't always visible to the outside world, but it shaped the atmosphere around him. When he finally stood at the top, it wasn't just as a preacher, it was as a figure carrying the weight of a fractured institution trying to hold itself together. When a spiritual leader rises through conflict, does the authority feel stronger, or does it carry the echo of everything it had to overcome? That question lingered beneath his ministry. Patterson continued preaching with intensity, his sermons still drawing crowds, his presence still commanding attention. Yet behind that energy was a constant balancing act, leading a global church while navigating the quiet aftershocks of its internal struggles. When he passed away in March 2007, at the age of 67, the loss hit deeply within the Church of God in Christ. His voice, once so immediate, was suddenly gone. Outside that world, however, many only recognized fragments of his influence, not the full scale of what had just been lost. His story carries a cinematic weight, because it was never just about sermons. It was about power, conflict resilience, and a voice that held a movement together long enough to leave its mark. Milton Brunson. Some leaders don't command a stage, they steady a room. Milton Brunson carried that kind of presence, quiet but immovable, the kind that didn't need volume to be felt. As the founder of the Thompson Community Singers, known simply as the Tommies, he didn't just assemble voices. He shaped a sound that felt like shelter. When they sang "Safe in His Arms," it didn't arrive as performance. It settled in like reassurance, something steady in the middle of uncertainty. His approach was different. Rehearsals weren't rushed. They moved with intention, almost like devotion. He taught singers to listen as much as they projected, to let space carry meaning as much as sound. Under his direction, harmony wasn't just technical, it was relational. Each voice had a place, and each entrance felt guided rather than forced. That balance gave the choir a distinct tone, warm, controlled, deeply rooted in purpose. What kind of influence doesn't need attention to endure? That question follows his legacy. Brunson didn't chase recognition beyond the church. His work spread through people singers who carried his methods into other choirs, congregations that felt something shift when his arrangements were performed. The reach was wide, even if the visibility wasn't. When he passed away in 1997, the news didn't travel far outside gospel circles. But within them, it landed with weight. Not because of spectacle, but because something steady had gone quiet. Yet the absence didn't erase the presence. His music continues to live where it was always meant to, in voices gathered together, finding strength in unity rather than display. He didn't build a career around the spotlight. He built a space where sound could become comfort, and that space still exists every time those songs are sung. Delois Barrett Campbell. Delois Barrett. Campbell never needed volume to dominate a room. She carried something deeper, a control that felt almost surgical in its precision. In Chicago, alongside her sisters Rhodessa and Billy as the Barrett sisters, she helped define a gospel sound that was both disciplined and emotionally exact. Where others leaned into raw power, Delois moved with restraint, shaping every note with intention, letting silence and phrasing do as much work as the voice itself. It was a style that demanded attention without ever begging for it. Their recordings didn't rush, they unfolded. Songs like "Jesus Loves Me" and "I'll Fly Away" became more than familiar hymns in their hands. They became studies in controlled tension and release. Delois, often at the center, guided the music like a conductor who understood that the smallest shift in tone could change everything. Her influence wasn't loud in the mainstream, but within gospel circles, musicians listened closely. They studied her timing, her breath, the way she could bend a phrase just enough to make it linger. What kind of artist shapes a genre not by overpowering it, but by mastering every quiet space inside it? That question follows her legacy, because Delois Barrett Campbell represented a different kind of greatness. She wasn't chasing visibility. She was refining a craft that others would spend years trying to understand. The Barrett sisters became a blueprint for vocal harmony and control, influencing generations of singers who carried that discipline forward. When she passed away in August 2011 at the age of 85, the loss resonated deeply where her music had always lived, in churches, choirs, and among those who knew exactly what she had built. Outside that world, the moment moved with far less noise. Her story feels cinematic not because it was loud, but because it was precise. A life spent shaping sound with intention, leaving behind music that doesn't just play. It holds long after the voice itself is gone. Mabel Mama Summers. The room didn't wait for silence, she created it. Mabel Summers stepped forward with a presence that didn't ask for attention, it commanded it. When she lifted her hand, choirs locked in. When she opened her mouth, the air shifted. Known for leading mass choirs with precision and fire, she turned songs into declarations none more enduring than "we're gonna make it." In her hands, that refrain wasn't encouragement. It sounded like a verdict over pain. Her path began in Washington, D.C., where she trained singers with a rigor that felt closer to discipline than rehearsal. She demanded blend breath and intention, teaching voices to move as one body while still carrying individual conviction. Under her direction, harmonies stacked with purpose modulations arrived like waves, and every crescendo felt earned. She didn't smooth edges to please crowds. She sharpened them to serve the message. What kind of authority can steady a room before a single note is sung? That question defines her legacy. Summers led in a space that often favored different faces and softer approaches, yet she never reduced her edge. She mentored younger vocalists, set standards others struggled to meet, and built choirs that could hold both power and control in the same breath. Even when the spotlight moved elsewhere, her influence traveled through rehearsal rooms, conferences, and singers who carried her methods forward. When she passed away in 2023, the wider media barely paused. But in the circles that knew her work, the absence was unmistakable. It sounded like a gap where a guiding voice used to be. Still, her imprint remains in every choir that refuses to rush, in every leader who insists on excellence, in every room that learns how to move together. She didn't chase visibility. She built sound strong enough to outlast it. They didn't just sing, they carried something people leaned on when life felt unbearable. And yet when they were gone, the silence around their passing said as much as their music ever did. So what does that reveal about how the world values voices rooted in faith, struggle, and truth? Were they overlooked, or did they belong to a space the spotlight could never fully reach? And if legacy isn't measured by headlines, then where does it truly live? If this stirred something in you, stay with us. Subscribe to Black Legends Revealed, because some voices don't fade. They wait to be remembered.